Well, everybody's very quiet and ready to start. So, shall we start? Hi, everybody. I'm Richard Konda, Executive Director of the Asian Law Alliance. We're one of the organizing groups here, and we want to welcome you to the 10th Annual San Jose Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution. As many of you know, in 1942, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which resulted in the detention, forced removal, and incarceration of approximately 125,000 men, women, and children because of their Japanese ancestry. Fred Korematsu fought against this injustice. I am sure if Fred Korematsu were alive today, he would be speaking out against the draconian attacks on civil liberties by the Trump administration. Fred's daughter, Karen Korematsu, is our keynote speaker. We also have a very exciting panel discussion with community members Yoshiko Kanazawa, Tom Izu, Yuki Nishimura, and Musa Tariq, who are providing some concrete action steps on fighting back and ways to get involved. At the conclusion of the program, the Japanese American Museum of San Jose will be open for viewing until 5 p.m. The museum is located across the street at 535 North 5th Street. I want to thank our co-sponsoring organizations, the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, Santa Clara University, the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Fred T. Korematsu Institute, and the Asian Law Alliance. Also like to thank the Wesley United Methodist Church for use of the fellowship hall. A special thank you to Scout Troop 201 for helping us set up the fellowship hall, the tables, and chairs. Also a special thank you to Japantown TV for taping the program today. Henry Nakata, Naoko Fuji, and Jeremy Rabbit. So as a note, the program is being taped, so if you have issues with that, raise your hand and we'll try to avoid taping you. We are really pleased that Jana Katsuyama is our MC today. Jana joined KTVU in 2007 and became part of the 10 o'clock news team in 2012. During her time at KTVU, Jana has won multiple Emmy Awards. Her investigation into paper automobile dealer plate loopholes led to the Assembly bill that changed California's license plate laws so new cars no longer can be on the road without a license plate. Jana enjoys volunteering for community organizations, helping the Northern California Cherry Blossom Queen program, the Japanese American Citizens League, the National Japanese American Historic Society, the Nichibei Foundation, Self-Help for the Elderly, and other groups. Let's all welcome Jana.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. As he said, I'm Jana Katsuyama with KTVU, Fox 2 News. I've been there since 2007, and it is just a delight to be able to be here to talk about some of these really important issues, the legacy of Fred Korematsu and the many different ways in which what he did still has relevance for us today in this year, 2025. Dr. Karen Korematsu is a very, very dear friend, and anytime she asks me to do something, I say, absolutely, what can I do? And I am just so delighted that we are able to have this very important gathering to really reflect on what it means to have a Fred Korematsu Day. Many of you might already know the history, the story of Fred Korematsu, but for those who don't, or for some who might maybe not know everything, I wanted to just start off with a little history about Fred Korematsu and this Day of Civil Liberties. So in 1998, when Fred Korematsu was awarded this country's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, President Clinton described him as a civil rights hero. And like many heroes, his journey began with an individual choice that he made. In 1942, Fred Korematsu was 23 years old. And at that time, the decision that he made was to not comply with the U.S. government's orders, which forced Americans of Japanese ancestry and Japanese immigrants into incarceration camps or concentration camps without any due process. After he was arrested, jailed, and then convicted of defying the government's order, Fred Korematsu agreed to challenge that conviction and appeal his case all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. In 1944, the Supreme Court ruled against him and stated that the incarceration was justified due to military necessity. In 1982, decades later, a legal historian and researcher discovered some key documents that government lawyers had hidden from the Supreme Court in 1944. Those documents showed that the US government had known that there was no evidence that Japanese Americans or Japanese immigrants posed any threat to national security. With this new evidence, the legal team reopened Korematsu's case by petitioning for a writ of error coram nobis, meaning that an error has been committed before us. And in this case, referring to an error that was made before the US courts by federal prosecutors on the part of the government. So on November 10th, 1983, Korematsu's conviction was overturned by the U.S. District Court of the Northern District of California, and that was a pivotal moment in our nation's civil rights history. Fred Korematsu spoke up not only to clear his own name, but also to remedy a wrong that was done to more than 125,000 U.S. residents of Japanese ancestry. In 1998, Fred Korematsu received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and he received that from President Bill Clinton. And after 9/11, he continued to speak out on behalf of American Muslim inmates who were being held in U.S. military prisons. In 2010, the state of California passed the Fred Korematsu Day bill, making January 30th the first day in the United States that was named after an Asian American. And we see Fred Korematsu's growing legacy continuing to inspire people of all different backgrounds, demonstrating the importance of speaking up to fight against injustice. We are so very honored to have Fred's daughter, Dr. Karen Korematsu, who is here as the keynote speaker today. She's the founder and president of Fred Korematsu Institute, which is based in the Presidio in San Francisco. She's a national speaker, travels to many different places throughout the country, bringing this message of her father and the fight that he made, as well as advocating for civil liberties, social justice, civic engagement, and ethnic studies education. She's currently working to have a Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution on January 30th in perpetuity in all 50 states. And I believe she will be talking to you a little bit about that. She signed amicus briefs opposing violations of constitutional rights. She helped to have a gathering of those people who were part of the Coram Nobis team for a tremendous gala day so that they could all come together from the far-flung places where they were to honor the legacy of what that meant. And I think we will all see that the fight of Fred Korematsu and the Korematsu Institute is a fight for all Americans and all people who come here who are residents of this country. So I'm so delighted that all of you are here to celebrate and to think about this. And if you would all please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Karen Korematsu.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today is January 25th, but my father's birthday is January 30th. So as I usually say on that day, happy birthday, Daddy. And thank you for all being part of that celebration. But also because obviously this is a very important time in our country. Some of you may not know how this, Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties in the Constitution started. Actually, it was some other people wanted, some people in San Diego, some judges wanted to have a day, and they talked about having a holiday. Well, that was a no-starter because, you know, that would cost money for the state, right? But then others decided that they still wanted the day, not only to honor my father, but for education. And so it was actually Assemblymember Warren Futani who came to me in February 2010 and to say, you know, would the family be, you know, approve this this possibility? But he said, it's not just going to be Fred Korematsu Day. It's Fred Korematsu Day of civil liberties and the Constitution. That's really the emphasis for my Father's Day, because we obviously know that we need to keep fighting for our civil liberties and the Constitution and upholding our democracy. And so really my Father's Day is more relevant now than ever. And you know, as Jana was saying, there's other states that have established the day, and so we had our first day on January 30th, 2011. Following was the state of Hawaii, Commonwealth of Virginia, as they like to be called, Florida, don't tell that governor, Arizona, New Jersey, and Michigan, and New York City. But there are several states that have bills in House, Massachusetts and New York. So it's really exciting to see this. But like I said, the point is education. The Korematsu Institute works with the National Council for Social Studies, which is our largest teacher-educator organization in the United States, and we work with them on curriculum to teach them about not only the history of the Japanese American incarceration, but the relevancy of those issues today. And it's so important to point out that these struggles, this intersectionality of all of our communities, our names may change in our faces, but the struggles are still the same, and that's why we need to uphold that. So actually, my father, some may not know that in 1942, when he decided to disobey the military orders, and he was sent to Tanforan, to that detention assembly center that's in San Bruno, racetrack, right? Down in Southern California, Santa Anita, and there's other racetracks or fairgrounds with racetracks. The community decided to have a meeting, and didn't invite my father. And so after the meeting, my father saw his oldest brother and said, well, what happened? And they said, Fred, we don't want you to keep fighting your case, because you're going to make it bad for everyone else. So my father was ousted and vilified by his own Japanese American community at that time. So he went it alone. I mean, no one wanted to talk to him. Was sent from Tanforan to Topaz. No one wanted to talk to him. And, because for Japanese Americans, right, he brought shame to the family. Our culture is like that. My grandmother cried, and my grandfather was disgusted, and his brothers didn't want anything to do with him either. But then in 1982, as Janice said, when they found the information in Washington, D.C., where they could reopen my father's case along with Gorin Hirabayashi and Minyasui, again, because of the redress and reparations bill that was happening at that time, as many of you will recall, the community said to my father, Fred, if you keep fighting your case and lose, then you're going to lose our chances for redress and reparations. But my father was determined, but he was never bitter or angry. For people who met him and heard him speak, he didn't blame anyone. It was as simple as the government was wrong and he was right to take a stand. And that's the way he felt. Now, I would be also remiss that, my father, obviously received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and then Gorin Hirabayashi and Minyasui received theirs posthumously, unfortunately, but at least they were recognized. The one person that, especially this last year, that we were advocating to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom was Mitsui Endo. Now, some of you may not know or remember who she was. She had the habeas corpus case at the time against the, in front of the Supreme Court, because she was a secretary in Sacramento, and she had not disobeyed the orders. She was put in a prison camp. She had no access to an attorney, hearing in court, being charged with a crime. And so she was saying to the government, hey, let me have my day in court or let me out. And so actually 80 years ago, last month on December 18th, her case was heard the same day as my father's. Now, the day before, the government and the military got wind to the fact that the Supreme Court was going to rule in her favor. All of them, 100%, 9-0. And so, of course, the military said, oh, well, then we're going to have to start letting people out. And so they announced on the 17th that on January 1945, they were going to start closing the camps, the incarceration camps. And so, this Mitsui Endo was a brave woman, right? Can you imagine a woman in camp and everybody wants her to back down, and not fight her case? And she went it alone, and she wouldn't. She said, I want my day in court. And so she unfortunately didn't get her day in court because there wasn't any reason for her to go on fighting her case because, the Supreme Court said, we're going to rule in your favor, and yes, this is wrong. So unfortunately, she didn't receive the Medal of Freedom, but we kept advocating. And so actually on January 2nd, I was invited to the White House, and she and her family were there, and she was presented with the Presidential American Citizens Award. So at least now I feel like full circle. She has been honored, and that's part of the stories that we all need to keep sharing and fighting for. So I was just over at the Japanese American Museum in San Jose across the street for their opening program of letters from camp. So I encourage you all to go over and see the letters, because this is another part of the story that people don't realize, the inhumanity. The incarceration was inhumane. And so, these are stories that we want to keep, bringing out and sharing with people across this country as well. To tell your neighbors. Not just and tell your family, your children, grandchildren, neighbors. Share your stories, because that's how we're going to learn to get along with each other, and keep fighting for each other, right? So, there's many different communities that need our support. In fact, after 9/11/2001, my father was one of the first to speak out when his case was being cited, Korematsu versus the United States, as a possible reason for Arab and Muslim Americans to be put in American concentration camps. And he said, no, you've done that, government. You can't do that again. So it's up to all of us to speak up, to be advocates, to know the truth. There's so much misinformation, disinformation out there, to know what the facts are, to make sure that what you're doing, sharing in social media, is actually true, and that to help organizations, like the Asian Law Alliance and CARE, who are fighting all these other battles, to support them as well, because everyone needs our help. And we would be a lot better in this country if everybody gave back and did just a little bit. That's what being an advocate is. And over time, it's an ebb and tide thing. Sometimes you have more time. When you have children, you don't. When you're older, you might. And as students, you can do other things to support these organizations and the causes that you feel are important to you. So that's what Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution means. And if my father were here, he would say to stand up for what is right and don't be afraid to speak up. And what I say to all of you is this is about all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And one of the things that I think we're going to talk about a little bit is how we approach this idea of the civil rights and the Constitution and civil liberties from many different perspectives in different parts of our community. And I'm so delighted that we have this amazing panel to be part of that conversation and to share their insights and things that they have been thinking about over the years around these concepts. So our next part of the program will have this panel along with Dr. Korematsu. We have Yoshiko Kanazawa, Tom Izu, Yuki Nishimura, and Musa Tariq. And we'd like to first start off, I hope you got cards at the entrance, but be thinking as you're listening to them if you have questions, and go ahead and fill those out, and we'll have somebody who can come by and pick them up. And then we'd really like this to be part of this program is a dialogue between you and also our panelists as well. So if you could please get those over to Richard, I think is somewhere here. He'll be the one who'll be going around and circulating. So to begin with, we'd like to start with Yoshiko Kanazawa. She's our first speaker. She was incarcerated in the camps in Tulare, California, and also Gila River, which is in Arizona, for 3.5 years during World War II. She has been a frequent speaker on her experiences in the camps because she really wants to ensure that what happened to her and her family does not happen again as part of this nation's history. So please, welcome to Yoshiko Kanazawa.
Hello. Okay. So I want to thank all of you for coming today, and I truly feel humbled to be part of this event. I'm from another generation than all the other speakers. I was one of the 120,000 people who were mass removed from their homes and incarcerated in camps in 1942. I was just a child, just 6 years old, a first grader. If you read obituaries of Japanese Americans born before 1945, you will notice that the camp they were in is always listed. It was a traumatic experience in our lives and affected each of us. Our own government labeled us as enemy aliens and took away our rights to live freely. My family was actually separated when our removal date arrived. I had just recovered from measles, but I had given it to my 2 older brothers and 2 older sisters. They had high fevers, they were very sick. My father went to the authorities, and with his poor English, he tried to explain that he could not leave right now. Could we just wait a couple of weeks and let the children get well, and then he would move as directed. The government denied him that request. They said, just leave the children in the house. The ambulance will go and pick them up after you're gone. And he said, I can't leave 4 of my children in a house that's almost empty now with no supplies. Fortunately, the government sent a doctor to our home, and the doctor said, I will arrange to have the children picked up while you're still here. And so my 2 brothers and my 2 sisters were taken in their bathrobes to LA County Hospital, and they were there until they recovered. They were sent to the camp in their bathrobes. And we were happy that we were all together now. But my parents later told me that they were not sure we would ever be united again because it was wartime. Every family and each individual have stories about their difficulties. The older people suffered the most. They lost their businesses, their homes, their farms, and their way of living. Young people felt lost opportunities in education and in their life plans. I was just a child. My main concerns were not about my rights or the Constitution. Instead, I was worried that I might run into a rattlesnake or a Gila monster or coyotes. One day we were released early from school because a sandstorm was coming, and the teachers told us, go straight home. And I was running like everybody else, and I thought, what if the sandstorm actually comes? Do I go and try to get into just anybody's house, or what am I going to do? I had this recurring dream where I was trying to find my way home through hallways with doors that led to more hallways and more doors. It was so frightening, and I realized that I felt trapped, even if I was a little girl. When the war was over, I was happy that I could return to Pasadena. And I started school immediately. I wasn't behind the other students, and that made me happy. The vice principal of my school had gone to each classroom and explained what had happened to me, that I was not an enemy, I was an American citizen, and that they should treat me well. The girls asked me to be in their Girl Scout troop immediately, and I remember wearing my uniform and saying the oath, on my honor, I will try to do my duty to God and to my country. And I thought, oh, I'm proving that I'm a loyal American, just like everyone else. But I did face hatred in some other situations. I was waiting for a bus at the bus stop in Pasadena, 11 years old, and a lady came up, tapped me on the shoulder, and said, go back where you came from. I didn't know what to answer when I was 11 years old. When I went home and told my parents, they said maybe her husband or her son was killed by the Japanese in the war in the Pacific. And they're blaming you. And you're going to meet people like that in your life. But you just have to do the best you can in school. Be the best person you can be, and someday you will be accepted. As I went through high school and college, many doors opened for me. My life in America has been like an American dream. I became a school teacher, and my husband ended up with a job at IBM, and we were having a good life. We were able to raise our boys just like every other American. But I always felt I was a second-class citizen. I should prove that I was a loyal American. My rights could be taken away again at any time. And I felt uncomfortable telling people about the incarceration, especially because some people would say to me, well, yeah, you were put in those camps, but look at what your people did at Pearl Harbor and what they did to our soldiers that they captured. Somehow, I didn't have the words to say, I didn't want the Japanese doing that to our soldiers. I didn't want them to bomb Pearl Harbor, but I was not responsible for that. No one blamed the Germans for what Hitler did, the Germans who were living here, but somehow we were always targeted. You know, my life was good though, and I just wanted to move ahead with my new family and not look back into the past. So for years, I remained silent, like many people from my generation. The younger generation who had not been incarcerated felt we needed to correct what had happened to their parents, their grandparents, and great-grandparents. In the 1980s, the Ninth Circuit Court decided that Fred Korematsu's conviction was unnecessary and unconstitutional. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1988 was passed by the Congress and signed by President Ronald Reagan. So we did get a letter of apology from the government. It came from President George Bush, the father. And we received $20,000 as a reparation check. It is truly my feeling that the letter meant so much more to me than the $20,000. The racism and the hatred of certain immigrants has been returning, especially in the last 20 years. This time, I am speaking up because I have heard stories like Karen's, where she told about what her father had done. And I felt like I have more courage now because of what people like that did. And this time, I am going to speak up. And I've been very grateful that the Japanese American Museum has given me opportunities to go out and speak to young students and to community groups. And people like Tom Izu have done so much to improve our situation. And I'm going to be part of this conversation and not shy away from it like I did for so many years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yoshiko Kanazawa, for sharing that deeply personal and so insightful perspective on our own nation's history. This is our American history that we are talking about and the stories that we need to remember. Yoshiko mentioned Tom Izu, who is our next speaker. He has been an advocate for the study of local history and civil rights and served as the first chairperson of the Nihon Machi Outreach Committee, a grassroots organization that was involved in the redress movement in the 1980s, and then in 2018, he also co-founded the San Jose Nikkei Resistors. You can see they have a table back here. Afterwards, please go visit their table. That is a multi-generational grassroots organization that has been involved in social justice issues. So thank you again, Tom, for being here, and we are so glad that you're on the part of the panel.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. As Yoshiko mentioned, Fred is a source of inspiration for those of us who wish to share the history of Japanese Americans and promote the defense of basic rights under the Constitution as championed by Korematsu Day and Karen Korematsu. But Fred's story is also of great interest to me because his life work demonstrates how ordinary people can keep our history in the fight for justice alive when others might give up. He was someone who knew that our history as Japanese Americans had not ended and continued working with others to keep the fire burning and to keep the significant thread in our history connected and continuing. So, for example, while imprisoned in Topaz concentration camp in 1942, he decided at a crucial junction in our history to join the efforts of the ACLU of Northern California to defend civil liberties by becoming the plaintiff in the famous case that bears his name. Then, in 1983, many years later, he does it again by agreeing to be part of the Coram Novus cases in an attempt to overturn the legal basis of the camps. But he doesn't stop there. Even after he won the decision to vacate his original conviction at the lower court levels, he then joined organizing efforts of the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations to fight for reparations for the camps during the last half of the 1980s through the redress bill's passage in 1988. Even after the redress victory, he continued to support civil liberties and rights over the ensuing years, again and again, especially for those denied individual due process based on race and national origin, as Arab Americans and Muslim Americans faced after 9/11 in 2001. He supported different lawsuits, lending his name to various related causes until his death in 2005. Fred didn't believe our history had ended in 1945 when the camps closed, didn't believe it ended in 1988 when Reagan signed the redress legislation, and didn't stop in 2001 when Japanese Americans across the country decided that defending Muslim Americans against scapegoating for the attacks on the World Trade Center was part of our history. From now on, I'm going to use the abbreviation JA, just so you know, because I'm lazy. I don't want to say the whole Japanese American over and over again. Viewing Fred's life in this way as keeping our history whole and intact for the cause of justice is something that continues to inspire me and helps me understand what we may lose if we forget this. One part of our history I think is being forgotten is the history of the redress movement itself. Many people know little about this history, and if they know anything about Japanese Americans, only know something about the camps. This even applies to many Japanese Americans. Our redress movement is significant because it came after decades of suppression, erasure, forced assimilation, and dispersal and destruction of our physical JA communities. It made our communities into ground zero for refuting that our history was over, bringing together organizations, institutions, and individuals who had been dispersed, creating a multi-generational voice. It came out of the movement for ethnic studies and out of our physical communities, especially San Francisco and Los Angeles, which were fighting for survival against destruction by way of redevelopment. Just as Korematsu first joined the civil liberties movement of the 1940s, as a young man, the next generation of Japanese Americans joined a new, expanded movement for social justice in the 50s, 60s, and 1970s. With the end of the 1970s, the focus of many JAs became the movement for demanding redress and reparations for the World War II forced removal and mass incarceration. The erasure of this historically important movement is something that we cannot let happen, because with it goes the link that keeps us connected to an intergenerational legacy of grassroots-based organizing, one that can help us face the deluge of trouble coming our way with the new administration now in power. Right out of college, I joined the Nihon Machi Outreach Committee, or NOC, known now for organizing the annual Day of Remembrances. In 1980, I did this here in Japantown, the same year that NOC joined together with other community organizations to help form the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations, or NCRR, one of the three main nationwide organizations, including the National JCL and the National Council for Japanese American Redress. NCRR's approach was different than the other two organizations. NCRR's strength was in place-based, grassroots community organizing, characterized by its work with the regular working-class Nisei, or second-generation JAs, along with Sansei, third-generation JAs, which that's what I am. Also, NCRR was clear that our fight for redress was connected to the fight for equality, rights, and self-determination for all oppressed people, not just JAs. In the 1980s, the community was not united on the idea of redress and reparations, but was in a keep a low profile, protect the community by circling the wagons mode. Cynicism reigned supreme, and most people, if they spoke about it at all, thought winning redress would be absolutely impossible, and something that could be dangerous to talk about for us. There was conflict and contention resulting from the collective trauma and impact of the camps. Organizations in our community had different views on the future of JAs and how we should deal with our camp history. But for most, ignoring it or keeping silent in public was the norm. But even facing this, we knew that the redress movement needed a united community, and we had to change the outlook and feelings of its members. We knew we had to work with the Nisei, who are our parents' generation, who experienced the camps period directly. And we needed to find the ones who would be willing to tell their stories and get others to do the same. Thus begun our adventure in intergenerational relationship building. As we did our work, an interesting grouping of formerly incarcerated Nisei found us, curious as to why a bunch of Sansei, or kids, were talking about redress in their community. These Nisei were seen by many local community members as cranks, because they couldn't stop talking about injustices they had seen or experienced, and other Nisei even advised us to stay away from them. They didn't fit in the model of leadership reserved for upper-class professionals with degrees. They were working class-based and very diverse in outlook and even politics. But they were the ones filled with a fire that had made others in our community initially uncomfortable. We knew they were the key to our future as young people searching for the way to be part of a movement for justice and equality as Japanese Americans. We worked shoulder to shoulder with them, helping them use their strengths in new ways. We provided the opportunity they needed to re-engage their community and play a leadership role. These were individuals such as Sue Tokushige, who had been a young mother when she entered Poston concentration camp and had a harrowing story of keeping her newborn baby alive without proper formula, and witnessing the death of another young mother's gravely ill newborn while on the train to camp because the military wouldn't allow the baby to stay in the hospital where it needed to stay. Years later, she would speak at school classes about her experiences, even when others told her in the community not to because it was too controversial. Mitz Koshiyama, who at the age of 18 was at Heart Mountain concentration camp, refused to be drafted into the U.S. Army unless the constitutional rights returned to him and his parents released. He was convicted and sent to a federal penitentiary for resisting the draft. Later, he was shunned by some members of his community because he was a convict and a draft resistor. And also this included Rudy Tokiwa, a decorated veteran wounded in the war and from the famous 442nd 100th Battalion segregated military unit. He acted bitter and angry about how he had been treated and how many of his comrades' sacrifices were forgotten or misunderstood. Nisei like these, became the leaders and spokespeople for our local redress movement, convincing others to join by their willingness to speak out and by their clear convictions that they were doing this not to glorify themselves, but to make sure that what happened to them did not happen to anyone else ever again. And I took this very personally because I know some of these, all these Nisei are gone. And that is what they told us. Okay, I'll help get this word out, but you have to understand, I don't want this to happen to anybody. And it really hurts me to see it happening again. It was no coincidence that these Nisei were just like Fred, secure in their knowledge of what was right and just, but needing a way to fit back into their community, which at the time could not create the opportunity for them to be who they really were. They wanted to be part of our shared history as JAs, so their stories and feelings could make sense, and they could do something. The vibrancy of this movement, based on the power of connecting our generations and history together, made it possible for us to learn how to begin to confront the fear, camp experience-based trauma within our community, which unfortunately continues to still affect us today. This movement also allowed us to explore new ways to bring together the community, socially and culturally. We created new community-wide events in San Jose, Japantown. And that time were considered radical and possibly dangerous, including Day of Remembrance, with the first candlelight procession through the streets of Japantown and several camp art shows featuring locally collected and curated crafts of artworks created by JAs while they're in the camps. It also gave us an opportunity to learn how to challenge barriers separating our community from other communities of color, including other AAPIs, African Americans, Latinx communities, to connect, learn, and build what we would now call multiracial unity in action. We normalized outreach and discussions with other communities. One story about this I'd like to share is at the Day of Remembrance event a long time ago, where Mitz Koshiyama was shocked to see so many other representatives of African American, Mexican American, other ethnic and minority organizations give support statements for redress. He turned to Susan Hayase, then chairperson of NOC, and whispered, "I thought they all hated us." Lastly, what I'd like to mention is what San Jose Nikkei Resistors, which I'm a co-founder of, is calling the Redress Movement 2.0. Our organization's legacy and lineage comes from the redress movement through NOC and NCRR's work in San Jose. Today, we face the Trump administration's threats to use the Alien Enemies Act, the same law used against us in World War II. And we who care about justice and equality are here living, breathing actors in JA history that did not end in 1945 or 1988. We are here to reflect on life's struggles and contribute and contributions of Fred Korematsu to fortify ourselves what lies ahead and to figure out how best to go about doing what we have to do now. We are now entering a difficult era in which anti-democratic and avowed white supremacists are taking the helm. We are always called upon to understand place and time to act accordingly in situations like this. JA history is not done but continues, and this is why SJNR is proposing what we call Redress 2.0, refocusing on where we are in time with our true history proudly unerased. Our strategy is to follow our roots in the redress reparations movement and work with people, place-based, in-person, multi-generational organizing, and building community power. And we learned the importance of intergenerational community-based work through the redress movement. And that's, I just want to emphasize why this is so important, because I hear over and over a lot of organizations in our community are going, how do you work with young people? Where are they? And I hear also young people saying, why do you always want to talk about the camps? There's other things to do. So right now, our strategy is to fight for continuing reparations, especially one of the things that we didn't win in the 1988 legislative victory was non-repetition. And non-repetition means don't let it ever happen again, as I was mentioning before. It keeps happening over and over again. But that was one of the things that we were demanding of the U.S. government. But we didn't get that. So this is really important for us to keep pushing that this struggle for reparations is not over. Repeal the Alien Enemies Act. I can't get that one right. Neighbors, not enemies. I think there's some information at the SJNR table, and there's some people who know a lot more about it than I do. But this act allows the government in times of war to detain nationals of nations the U.S. is at war with. This act was used during World War II to round up Japanese nationals, our Issei, and leading up to the mass incarceration. The current administration is using this act right now as the basis for planned roundups. We want to continue support for redress for slavery, which we were supporting through the H.R. 40 bill, which did not get voted on this last time around. We think this is part of continuing reparations struggle. We want to fight to defend other communities in their civil rights and liberties. Recently, right in this very church, we helped host a rapid response network training program, and we encourage people to sign up for this. This is a group that wants to make sure that the most vulnerable migrant and immigrant members of our community, that their rights are protected, as they are supposed to be under our Constitution. A lot of people don't understand, regardless of citizenship, the Bill of Rights is for everybody. So there's more information about that also at the SJNR table. There have always been Nikkei, Japanese Americans, willing to fight for equality and justice since the first ones arrived in the U.S., and to work within and without our community to do this. This is a history that is not about to end. We can gain strength and hope from this history, but only if we can envision a community inclusive, united across generations, and composed of everyone who wishes to join with us. JAs have a role to play, and it is an important one, filled with a history that can make us strong and hopeful. It is a form of living resilience that we build in real time, in a real place, and starting right now. Thank you very much.
Tom Izu, thank you. Our next speaker is Yuki Nishimura. Yuki is a Japanese immigrant who serves on the board of the Japanese American Museum, San Jose. She's the development and outreach manager of the Silicon Valley Office of Human Rights Watch, a global nonprofit dedicated to investigating and reporting human rights abuses worldwide. I also want to say that she is a Northern California cherry blossom queen. I had the honor of being one of the MCs when she was chosen, but really that program focuses on leadership and community connection. It is not a pageant, as they will say. It really is about trying to educate and trying to bring young people into the community and understand the community. So I'm so delighted to see Yuki here to share her thoughts about this.
Thank you so much, Jana. It's such an honor to be here, and when I looked at the panel list, I was really confused at first because I was like, why am I in this panel? Like, of all these esteemed speakers, and myself, like, well, what do I have to share within this? And I started with really thinking about my own identity as an immigrant to this country. And I'm still not a citizen here. I'm a legal permanent resident in this country, and my sister's the only one actually in our family who is a U.S. citizen because she was born here. And I know that concept of birthright citizenship is even right now under attack, as we all know. And when I remember the first time that Trump was elected, and I remember seeing that in 2016, I was really trapped with this sense of fear. Even though, I'm legally here, it still really instilled in me this fear that I don't belong here, that maybe people will see me differently now, that every time I cross the border, that is going to be a dangerous experience for me and for so many people like me. And I remember I was not like Fred Korematsu at the time. I really retreated into myself. I was scared, and I thought, I'm not going to go outside as much anymore. This is how I'm going to keep myself and my family safe. We're just going to stay in, and that's it. Don't speak up. Don't say anything. And I remember, though, towards the end of his presidency, I thought, this was just not the way to do this. This is not what I need to be doing right now. I need to learn. I need to connect with my community. And so for the first time, I became more connected with the Japanese American community in 2019, through actually the Queen program, as Jana was mentioning. And there, I learned of the history that I learned in high school of Japanese American incarceration, which truly was, in my textbook, about this big, in my textbook. And I learned that there's so much more there, so many things that I didn't know about. And that's where I decided to do my graduate thesis on the Japanese American redress movement. But specifically, I wanted to look at a group of people who were excluded from the redress and reparations, and that was the Japanese Latin Americans. Now, many of you, of course, have heard of the Japanese American incarceration experience during World War II, but there was also a group of 2,264 Japanese Latin Americans who were essentially kidnapped by the US government during World War II, brought to this country on a ship. Their passports were taken away once they boarded that ship, and when they came to the US, or when they were forced to come to the US, they were deemed illegal aliens because they didn't have the documentation, despite the fact that the US government was the one who took the papers away. I remember speaking with one of the survivors from that experience. She was 9 years old at the time, and she told me that she was stripped naked alongside her entire family, and how she was sprayed down by some sort of chemical or some sort of, she doesn't know what substance it was, how scared she was when she had to board the train, and she didn't know where she was being taken to and whether she was going to be alive at the end of that trip. They were taken to Crystal City, Texas, in a DOJ camp there. And many people ask, well, why did the US government do this? And many of them were used for hostage negotiation exchanges, basically as pawns in the hostage negotiation exchanges. Now, after World War II ended, a number of them were either returned back to their country, back in Latin America, if the country accepted them. Peru did not. Some of them were deported to Japan. Like the woman I was talking about earlier, she was deported to Japan, to 1945 Hiroshima, which, as many of you know, the nuclear bomb was dropped there. And so it was a devastating area that she had to return to. But, and I say return, but she had never been there before, right, her entire life. And others, because, for instance, Peru refused to accept back people to their country, had decided to stay within the US and try to fight to gain citizenship later on. Now, many of you may know Art Shibayama, and I see that Art's family is here as well. He was located here in San Jose, and he was one of those as well. Now, Fast forward to 1988. The Civil Liberties Act was a huge victory for Japanese Americans. It truly was. It was such a monumental act that happened. But within that, there was an eligibility criteria that stated that the person had to be a US citizen or a US legal permanent resident in order to receive the $20,000 and the letter of apology. That essentially excluded Japanese Latin Americans. And I wanted to understand, why did this happen? Was this some sort of mere technicality? And it wasn't. What I quickly found in my research through speaking with 25 different people and individuals who were part of this redress movement, I learned that this was something of a decision that was made throughout the process. Now, early 1970s, when redress was becoming more of a topic that was being discussed, the language of human rights was everywhere. It was a violation of human rights that we experienced in the camps. And also, Japanese Latin Americans were intentionally included as part of the people who should be eligible for reparations. This was also the time during Jimmy Carter's presidency. So many of you, I know, because of his recent passing, there's been a lot of news about the sort of legacy and impact he had on human rights. And that sort of excitement towards human rights was very palpable even in the redress movement in those early stages. But as redress continued on to the late 70s and early 80s, what we saw was a rise in one, US trade war with Japan, and therefore rising anti-Japanese sentiment. Maybe of you remember the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982 as one incident. And there was also the conservative Reagan administration coming in. And so the redress leaders who were crafting the legislation, the later iterations of it, you could see that human rights, the language of human rights as the violation that took place, starts getting replaced with civil rights. It was because we were citizens, because we were legal permanent residents here, that we should not have been violated, that these sorts of rights should not have been under attack because we were citizens. We are Americans just like you. And that was the strategy that was taken. But what happens when you do that is that what happened was that it was the exclusion of Japanese Latin Americans who did not quite fit the citizenship or the legal permanent residency requirement within it. Now, it's very interesting to think about that there's only 2 instances that you can see human rights, the language itself, be used in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Once was in the margin, that's the first time. It's kind of very symbolic, right? Like human rights being marginalized. But the second time that you see it is actually in the purpose section. And in it, it talks about human rights violations that take place outside of our borders. You see, this is the concept of American exceptionalism at play here. What that means is that within our borders, within the US, the violations that take place are civil rights violations. But outside of our borders, that's where human rights violations take place. And you can see it really if you read this 1988 Civil Liberties Act, you can see that at play. And so Art Shibayama was one individual who continued to fight for his redress and his reparations. Most importantly, to get recognized by the US government for the violations that he suffered and so many other Japanese Latin Americans had suffered. He went through the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, so he took the path of human rights. And in 2017, he finally had his case heard before the commission. Unfortunately, before the 2020 ruling came out, where there was a finding that the US did violate human rights, he had unfortunately passed before then. But this is really kind of the story of the long arc of justice, right, with human rights. And when I think about how is that relevant to today, why is this relevant to today? I can't help but see a lot of parallels, and perhaps maybe you have been, as I'm talking about this, see a lot of parallels as well. When we talk about rights that is based on the fact that we are citizens or that we are legal permanent residents, there's a limitation there. We have to go farther than that. It has to go one step further. In fact, that's kind of what I see as like the redress movement 2.0. That is the next stage that I think we need to be thinking about. Human rights violations happen here in the US as well. And we need to first confront that and embrace that and understand that that's a framework that allows for more inclusivity, that allows for those marginalized voices to be finally heard, to be included, and to be recognized. I had a talk with my dad earlier this week when we were watching the inauguration of Trump. And this time around, I told him that unlike last time, we're not going to be hiding, right? I learned what Fred Korematsu and so many others like him had done to stand up and to speak up. And I believe that's the path forward for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuki. Our next speaker is Musa Tariq. Musa is the policy coordinator at the Council on American Islamic Relations, San Francisco Bay Area. In his position, he fosters and sustains relationships on the federal, state, and local level with policymakers, elected officials regarding CARE's mission, its priorities, and he has been a frequent speaker about the basics of Islam and anti-discrimination. Please welcome Musa Tariq.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to have to ask you to clap one more time. Let's give another round of applause to our amazing, inspiring speakers today. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you all today at the beautiful Wesley United Methodist Church. Thank you for having me here today on Korematsu Day, a day when we honor the legacy of Fred Korematsu and his immeasurable contributions lifting up the voices of the oppressed for generations. I may not be sitting here today speaking to you all if it wasn't for him and other major civil rights leaders of his time. We're gathered here today not to just reflect on the past, but to confront the present, a moment when history is repeating itself in dangerous and disturbing ways. When I started thinking about what I'd say today, it was the week before inauguration. We all expected the worst coming into a second Trump presidency, but this last week has felt unprecedented all the same. The last few days have been an onslaught of attacks on our most vulnerable communities and key civil rights protections, from unconstitutional attacks on birthright citizenship to revoking the 1965 Equal Employment Opportunity Act, which prohibits employment discrimination based on race, sex, color, religion, and national origin, to ICE raids terrorizing schools, homes, places of worship, attacking environmental justice, gutting diversity and accessibility initiatives on a federal level, eliminating avenues for legal immigration, censoring and attacking public health, and so much more. That's just exhausting to say in one go. And I'm sure we have all been watching the news, and it seems that every day we wait for that inevitable heart drop when we see what new horrors are unleashed by the Trump administration, fueled by the inaction of the previous Biden administration. We are already seeing the most blatant upward transfer of wealth and the greed of oligarchs laid bare before our eyes, with Trump surrounding himself with the most powerful men in the world that have built their wealth on exploitation. No moment better reflects the moment that we're in and what's to come than Elon Musk aggressively and confidently throwing up a Nazi salute twice in front of the entire world. We all know what it was. News broadcasts in numerous countries have censored his gesture. This morning, Elon Musk spoke at a far-right rally in Germany saying, "I think there's too much focus on past guilt, and I think we need to move beyond that. Children should not feel guilty for the sins of their parents and their grandparents even." This is what Elon Musk said this morning to a far-right rally in Germany. The most despicable forces in our country have seized power, and they intend to do great harm. Yet, we've been here before, and that's what we've been talking about today. During World War II, over 120,000 Japanese Americans were ripped from their homes and thrown into internment camps after a campaign of dehumanization and discrimination. No trial, no evidence, just fascist violence, fear-mongering, and racist propaganda that tore apart innocent people's lives. They were accused of being disloyal, dangerous, a threat to American society. Fred Korematsu fought back when it was dangerous, when it seemed impossible, and when he was told by others to accept his fate. His resistance laid the groundwork for justice. The Supreme Court overturned his conviction 4 decades later, and the U.S. government was forced to apologize for its crimes. The internment of Japanese Americans is now universally recognized as a shameful chapter in American history. And to this day, the Japanese American community is healing from the traumas of internment, and no reparations could ever address one of the gravest sins in American history. And today we see the same rhetoric being used against marginalized groups facing the deafening echoes of history, including Asian Americans, immigrants, the LGBTQ+ community, Black and brown people, Indigenous Americans, and more. In particular, Muslims and Palestinians face continued discrimination and persecution as they speak out against the genocide in Gaza. Amnesty International, one of the world's leading human rights organizations, has found sufficient evidence to conclude that Israel has committed and is continuing to commit a genocide against Palestinians in the occupied Gaza Strip. There hasn't been a single day since October 7th that Israel hasn't killed a Palestinian baby or child. And as we speak, hundreds of thousands of families have been killed, entire families wiped out, tens of thousands of children left orphaned, and most of Gaza's infrastructure decimated. This is a relentless assault on a people who will not go in silence, and this is the result of a persistent campaign of dehumanization and racism. Just as Japanese Americans were labeled enemy aliens in their own country, pro-Palestine students and activists are being branded as threats for speaking out against a genocide. Last year, students who were advocating for Palestinians faced physical and verbal attacks, suspensions, police brutality, and more. And with media and elected officials demonizing student protests, there was an alarming rise in violent attacks against unarmed, vulnerable students by law enforcement and outside agitators. Universities, emboldened by Trump, are threatening to expel students for daring to be anti-genocide. ICE is targeting international students who protest against genocide, using this to expand upon the Muslim ban that Trump is already building the infrastructure to reinstate. This time, he will predicate the Muslim ban on targeting pro-Palestine immigrant students and calling them terrorists, all while ignoring the white nationalist Nazi domestic terrorism that he continues to embolden, encourage, and enfranchise. The message is clear. Dissent will not be tolerated. The goal is to isolate us, silence us, discredit us, and pacify us by any means necessary. And pro-Palestine voices will not be the only target. We know what history looks like. Anyone who challenges this fascist agenda is subject to silence and violence. But we will not go quiet. The internment camps were justified by fear. The Muslim ban was and is justified by fear. The repression of pro-Palestine voices is justified by fear. Trump's attacks on our marginalized communities is justified by fear, and we are afraid too. But their fear is ignorance, and our fear is the recognition of the past and present, of the patterns of history. We fear families being torn apart. We fear violent discrimination. Fascism does not survive without fear, but it depends on people being too afraid to resist. And know this. Fascism is built to fall. Fear is temporary. Fear is short-term. Fear is fallible. Love and solidarity are invincible. They last hundreds of generations. Today's tyrants will be tomorrow's dust. Love will always outlast hatred. I will leave you with some words from Fred Korematsu. According to the Supreme Court decision regarding my case, being an American citizen was not enough. They say you have to look like one. Otherwise, they say you can't tell the difference between a loyal and disloyal American. I thought that this decision was wrong, and I still feel that way. And as long as my record stands in federal court, any American citizen can be held in prison or concentration camps without a trial or a hearing. That is, if they look like the enemy of our country. Therefore, I'd like to see the government admit that they were wrong and do something about it so this will never happen again to any American citizen of any race, creed, or color. Fred Korematsu said this in 1983. And this week, Trump said this about immigrants, quote, "We have open borders with people pouring in, some of whom, I won't get into it, you can look at them and you can say, could be trouble, could be trouble. Indeed, there will be trouble for them and their racist, fascist agenda." God bless you all. Thank you.
So one of the things that I think we've been hearing from many of the people on the panel is this conflict and this tension when a community is marginalized or seen as other. The tension sometimes the lonely path that people take as they try and fight for what they think is right, and the complications even within our own communities, the divisions that it can spark, the deep despair and discussion over how to best respond to that, whether you take a path that is laid out for you and try and follow that as best you can to prove your loyalty, whether you take a stand against that and fight either through the legal system or fight in other ways through Congress towards reparations, whether you fight on the streets through demonstrations that we have seen numerous ways, whether it be in the difficulties in Gaza, in Ukraine, with the idea of who is American and who is not. As Karen, I know that's something as of a theme in your programs, and also just within the community. For people within a community, who is allowed to represent, who is allowed to speak, who is kind of pushed to the side and marginalized. And so starting off, one of the questions that we received is, how did Fred and the Japanese American community reconcile and unite? And that's something that, I think we have seen this kind of tension, and Karen, you mentioned that about your father, even being within the community and the camps, being ostracized. So how was that path to try to find some sort of unity or a recognition of the role that he took and the path that he took?
Well, thank you for that question. But first of all, I'd like to thank the panelists for your comments. Really incredible and very heartwarming. Sorry. I was going to cry. I think, as I said, my father was never bitter or angry. And the fact that he faced all this with if you asked him what made, how did he do this, what made him do this to stand up against the incarceration and the military necessity, it was embedded in him. It was the moral principles of simply right and wrong. It sounds very simple, and sometimes we make life and our issues too complicated, that we need to bring it down to what really matters. And the fact that he wasn't one of these people that spoke out against anyone. When his federal conviction was finally overturned, in 1983, that's when the community, they came up to him and certainly put their arms around him. And my father could have very well said, hey, Japanese American community, you didn't want anything to do with me. Why should I have anything to do with you? But he wasn't like that. I mean, even some of the leaders of the JACL were, against him. But right after his conviction was overturned and he was invited to the JACL or any organization, he showed up. He was there. He was there, and what was important for the redress and reparations movement was to create this solidarity. And I think that's what we need to remember, that yes, he was one person that made a difference in the face of adversity, but really going forward, it was a solidarity and working together on those issues that was so important and impactful, right? It was going to lobby in Washington D.C. With NCRR, and there was even pushback against NCRR. So you had all these different fractions, and it was the people finally realized that they had to come together. They had to work together. You can agree to disagree, but you have to find that common ground, right? And to know what the outcome you want is going to be, because it's not just for one person. It's about all of us, as I said, and that's the way my father lived his life. I mean, even when he received these awards, it wasn't just for himself. It was for his Japanese American community that he also was representing. And it's important to know that who we are, who we represent, our own integrity, our own moral principles, but to know that in order to move forward in this country, that the solidarity and working together with organizations to get out of our silos, right, and to have that intersectionality, that's where we're going to make a difference. That's where we can fight back. And it's going to take all of us to do that.
Thank you so much. And that goes to another question that we have here, where oftentimes there are portions of groups that are targeted. And certainly in the Japanese American history of this, the United States really targeted what are called Issei, or the first generation immigrants. They went after them, they rounded them up, they put them in jail, tried to take leaders of community groups, leaders of the Buddhist temples, leaders of the church, leaders of business organizations. And so one of the questions here is, U.S. tried to destroy the JA community by taking the Issei from their leadership, set people against each other, including resistors of all sorts. So how was it that, and you talked a little bit about this, Tom, but the path towards redress, the path towards that apology, the path towards that recognition from the larger American community. What are the ways that that we were able to get out of the silos, to be able to make those bridges in order to have something like this done?
Hi, can you hear me? Well, I don't have an answer for that. But it was, it was.
And I think there, part of it is too, how does it translate? What are the lessons that have been learned from that moment that other groups that are here, other groups that are struggling with similar issues, with loss of, divisions internally, what are lessons that can be applied to other people?
Well, it's connected to the last question too, because the way I look at it is this community, this might sound strange, but I think our ability to be political was really, really truncated by the camp experience, because exactly what you're talking about. Because when you imagine you have basically the adults of a whole community, these are the Issei you're talking about, they're totally disempowered, and some of them actually removed from the families. And then you have the Nisei, most of them, not all, but many of them were pretty young, being pushed into, okay, you're the leaders, you're the official leaders the government represents. You can see the kind of dynamic that would create, and you could read all about this in actual descriptions in camp life, how they actually were really pitted against each other at different times. So you can see this is not a good starting point for a healthy community, regardless of generational problems. And I think this really impacted years later in our community, its ability to understand political struggle, to understand that you're going to have differences, to understand you're going to have to work them out, to understand there's always going to be contradictions. Because I see that in our community when I was younger and becoming involved in here, some of the very intense feelings that people would have, the way organizations operated, I really think this could be traced back to that kind of experience of being politically, in a way, kind of decapitated. And I said that might sound like a strange comment because look at San Jose. In some ways, very oddly, we are this country little town, but we had Norman Mineta, who was a congressman, cabinet member. We had actually a lot of people like Mike Honda, too. A lot of political stuff happened here, but that's not the kind of politics I'm talking about by itself. I'm talking about how your function operates. Can we be democratic in how we operate? Can we tolerate differences in opinion? So I think my generation has had to deal with that, and I don't think we've completely overcome that, but I do have hope. But the main thing is that we have to recognize some of these factors that have affected us historically, and then kind of put them in their place and understand, like Karen is saying, well, what is our goal? Do we have a strategy to get there? What can we work on? How can we work together? And you don't have to just have one single thing, well, this is what I want to happen, and that's all I care about, so forget everybody else, because you're not obviously going to get anywhere. So I'm not sure. I don't think I answered the question, but...
Well, and I think that's interesting, too, that you talk about democracy within our organizations, and that if we're asking for democracy from our country and from others, how does that also get replicated within the organizations that we are forming, that we are participating in? How much are we also allowing for some flexibility and inclusiveness of different voices? And I did want to just briefly see, because I don't know if Musa, Yuki, or Yoshiko-san, you also have some ideas, but this idea too, I think, with the immigrant generation oftentimes, where maybe because of language, maybe English isn't their first language, maybe they are, like our Issei Japanese American generation, head to the ground, trying to just do the best to eke out a living, survive. And sometimes there can be that generational difference between the native born or English fluent, maybe more American culture fluent generation, and the parent generation or immigrant generations who, are trying to make things work. What are your thoughts in terms of that kind of tension and, the differences in how to get beyond that, how to go beyond that and still keep moving forward?
I just want to comment that when we were in the camps, I remember different factions, but that affected those generations. And young children like me weren't affected in that same way. But like my father-in-law was 42 at the time, and he felt that the young people should all try to be loyal to America, go and serve in the 442 or MIS. He served in the MIS. When he got up to give a speech about doing this at Amachi, my husband remembers how many people in the audience were banging the tables with spoons. And he remembers just crying over that, to see his father treated that way. But then later, when Congress gave all the military who had served and the Congressional Medal, then he felt so good about that what his father had done was right. And so the newer generation, like my sons and my grandchildren who are here, they don't remember that part, but they remember how their grandfather was honored. And so we have a different perspective of what might have happened.
If I can add to that a little bit, it's interesting for me because as an immigrant to this country, I'm actually the one probably teaching my parents about the lessons that I've learned through being part of the Japanese American community. So I know I hear often from my friends who are already in the Japanese American community about how they heard from their grandparents or their parents about this legacy. And for me, it's kind of reversed. Like I'm pushing and telling them the stories that I'm learning because it's not necessarily the history that they have learned in Japan. So how that looks like is I can pinpoint to you the exact moment that the Japanese American incarceration experience really hit home for me. And it was at the Presidio Museum that I went to back in 2019. I think it was called Then They Came for Us, or Then They Came for Me. Thank you, Then They Came for Me. And I was walking through, just taking notes about looking at the photos and just taking notes. And then there was this one photo of this young boy, and it spoke about his family, I think it was his father who did kendo, a Japanese martial art, and how his father was then deemed a community leader who was very dangerous and therefore like someone who was taken away early from this boy. And I remember seeing that photo, and it really, truly hit me like a ton of bricks in that moment. Because I practice naginata, which is a Japanese martial art as well. And I practice it thinking that we practice it thinking about like harmony and about peace, and that's kind of like the teaching that we have. Never about it being a threat or it being used as harmful to somebody else. And so I realized in that moment, like if I had been living in that time, I would have been deemed a threat. And I think it was just such a moment for me when I realized that was something that Dr. Korematsu, you mentioned how, this is a story about us. It truly is. Even though it's not my own family history, it's something that I learned. It is something about me and something that I want to keep telling others, including to my family upwards in the generations as well. And I remember the next day, actually, was the Queen Program pageant. And Jana, you were there as the MC, and Dr. Korematsu, you were the judge, one of the judges. And I remember sharing this story during the judges' panel interview, and you were the one who said that you went there. I mean, I helped to put that on, and that, you were really there for the beginning of my journey of learning about Japanese American incarceration. And that journey still continues to this day, right? We have amazing organizations here today with CARE, we have San Jose Nikkei Resistors, we have the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, and we have, I see, Nichibei Foundation here as well. And there's so many different programs that each of these community organizations hold, right? Films of Remembrance is coming up on February 23rd here in San Jose. That's where I learned a lot through visual media about Japanese American incarceration as well. And I think connecting back to community, learning and teaching about our history, even to those that might not necessarily be immediately within our community, is just as important.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your perspectives. Hopefully I'm not straying too far from the intent of the original question, but just speaking from my experience, from maybe a post 9/11 perspective, I was born in Pakistan in 1999, and my family came to the States in 2001, and my upbringing was very much indicative of that experience. There was a bit of a culture of maybe submission or silence as my dad was building our life here in the country, of working hard. He used to say this thing all the time, that if the white man has to work 100%, I had to work 110%. Now, it may seem like there's virtue to that statement, but I feel like there's a nature of internalized oppression to that statement. And he never told me not to speak up. He never told me not to advocate, but I realized that he had to make those sacrifices by keeping his voice silent and building that life for us here to enable me and empower me and my brothers to be able to speak up and to speak our truth and live our identity more freely. And I feel like everything I'm saying here today is built on the sacrifices of my mother and father and, the family before them as well.
There are three cards here that kind of deal with sort of legal issues around Korematsu. So I want to, Karen, just have, because you're used to talking about these, I want to kind of pull them together just very briefly. One is about Executive Order 9066, and could that still be used for another group? That was an executive order, and we've been hearing a lot about executive orders. So just in terms of its relevance to today, and then also combined with that is why the ACLU, what their role was defending Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui in the initial trial and on the appeals, on the path to appeals. So with the ACLU, and then they also another person was asking about the majority's reason for rejecting Sotomayor's argument concerning Korematsu in the Trump versus Hawaii case, which was the travel ban case, which actually was kind of a double-edged sword in a way. So I guess if you could maybe address some of those. I guess first of all, Executive Order 9066, that was an executive order, right?
So for some of you that may not know, well, maybe you do know now, that the executive order is the privilege of the president. Actually, that's not in the Constitution, which I find interesting. But it is a privilege, and so they can, like President Roosevelt, I'll give that example of EO 9066, and they wouldn't use that particular one again, but that was based on military necessity. And so therefore, it had to do with the military, which we now call national security. So the president can say, oh, because of national security, then I'm going to have this executive order, and that's actually what this current president did in 2017 when he was president at that time, and issued what was first the Muslim ban. And then there was pushback against that, and then they said, oh, well, we'll call it the immigration ban, and of course then there was pushback on that, and then it was like, well, the travel ban because they included Venezuela. So those are kind of some of the issues, and what I call it is the Muslim travel ban. I mean, let's call it what it was, and is then also the talk has been to reissue that. So when the Supreme Court case was submitted in Trump versus Hawaii, the Attorney General of Hawaii, Doug Chin, was the one that brought that case against the president, and then that's when my father's Quorum Nobis team and Gordon and Mins, we all got together and say, hey, we need to submit an amicus brief. An amicus brief is friends of the court brief. And what we were trying to do, using my father's case, since it was more of the major case, was to remind the court of my father's case, because even though his federal conviction was overturned or vacated in 1983, the Supreme Court record still stood. The Supreme Court can only reverse itself. And so, and the other part of it was the dangers of overreaching of power. So, and then I put my name to it. Holly Yasui, Min's daughter, who unfortunately passed away during COVID, and Jay Hirabayashi, Gordon's son, and I, submitted the amicus brief, but it was more, kind of with a lot of support and written, legally. And so what happened at that time was, Justice Sotomayor, because the justices discussed what their decisions were going to be, and who's going to be the majority opinion, who's going to be the minority opinion, and so the Chief Justice Roberts knew already of Justice Sotomayor's opinion, and she basically, what I say, went for the jugular. And if you want to ever read an interesting, dissent, and I'm always pointing out the dissents in these Supreme Court decisions, hers is very significant. But all Justice Roberts said was Korematsu was overruled in the court of history. That's his opinion. That's called dicta in legal terms. Whether or not my father's case can be used again, stay tuned. And some legal people will say yes, some no. I mean, you get all these different opinions, but I know what, don't tell me any differently, because it clearly was just his opinion. And so that's what happens with these legal cases. Now, what's going to happen? We've only been a week here, friends. I mean, it seems like a year is what I keep saying. And we don't know what kind of lawsuits are going to be coming up. But you can be sure that a lot of us in the community are going to be in support of other communities, depending upon what this is. And I've already said that I've been interviewed before this president took office, and especially when it comes down to the separation of families for undocumented immigrants, that's wrong. And any way you look at it, it's wrong to separate families. And even some of the families that were separated before, that were in Crystal City, the children have not been reunited with their families. Because they'll ask, the records have been lost, and somebody will say, well, what's your parents' name? Mom, Dad, I mean, maybe in Spanish, but you know what I'm getting at here. So this is kind of the, this is the dysfunction that happens, that we have to keep making our government accountable. We have to keep speaking up. We work together in solidarity to work into these different communities, so that we can really challenge the wrongs that we see. I mean, the reason my father reopened up his Supreme Court case in 83 was, yes, he wanted to be vindicated. He wanted the Japanese American community to be vindicated, but he didn't want something like the Japanese American incarceration to happen again. And that's why he spoke up after 9/11, and that's why we keep seeing these same types of issues that, like I said, the names and the faces may change, But when we lose our sense of our democracy and our civil liberties in the Constitution, we all have to speak up and be supportive of all those different organizations that are trying to right the wrongs.
And Karen, I think you get to one of the questions, which is, what can we do to prevent these kinds of events, these incidents from being repeated in our own history? One of the things that has also come up here in some of the questions is looking at ways of working across communities. And we've heard a little bit of this post 9/11. We've heard about this, also coming up, we have the, anti-Asian hate. We have some of the issues around, our southern border and immigrants from all over. So one of the things, and I'm going to sort of combine these two, which is one question that says, the Fred Korematsu legacy highlights the dangers of racial discrimination and the importance of standing up against injustice, even when it is sanctioned by the government. How can lessons from this fight for civil liberties inform our understanding of the Palestinian struggle in Gaza for human rights? And also a question of examples of how the Japanese American community is working with other communities to try and bridge these silos, to try and look past whatever stereotypes might be out there or presumptions might be out there. So I just like if anybody wants to start with that or kind of reflect a little bit on that. Oh, sure. So there were two kind of what I think of as similar questions. One is, how can this, history, the JA history, also perhaps inform the way that we conceive of some of the other struggles, such as the Palestinian struggle for human rights, and then also the ways in which people are working across silos, across communities of color. What are you seeing in your work on the ground in that area?
Cool, thank you. Thank you for repeating that.
Thank you for repeating the question. I just wanted to make sure I got that right. So I believe intersectionality is really key in some of the advocacy that I've been doing in terms of being anti-genocide, because this is a very universal moral struggle. When you see this many people disproportionately being killed, innocent men, women, and children, it's very visceral, it's very emotional, it's very personal. So, and I think in my experience and all the protests, the advocacy, the groups that have been with me as we've spoken to elected officials, they have been from all walks of life. The diversity is just incredible to see how many people are plugged in and really care. Sometimes it's difficult to read the news again and again, and you feel this insurmountable feeling of hopelessness. But I think that the intersectionality of all of the communities around that really deeply care about what's going on is so important. And as we're talking about the legacy of Fred Korematsu and the struggles that he fought for, those struggles intersect with so many different groups. Fred Korematsu was even speaking out for Muslims post 9/11, so it's really an interconnected web. I think I look at this room today and there's so many different kinds of people here, and I think that's really, really important. I hope that was sufficient.
Thank you so much. And I think, Karen, if you could speak a little bit too, because I think what you get at and what we're hearing here too is this concept of what does it mean to be American? Who is American? What is America? Who belongs in America? And that's something which I think we're seeing in our history, this constant struggle and attempt to try and define by different groups what it means, who's involved. And you were mentioning when we had a conversation about something that your father had said that is now part of the theme of your educational process. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, right now, the Korematsu Institute, we have a travel exhibit that's been funded by the National Park Service Japanese American Confinement Site Program. And it's called Am I an American or Am I Not? And that's what my father said, because it was a question. And even growing up in school, I grew up in the East Bay and Southeast Bay, and so around the time of December 7th, it was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So the teacher would bring that up, and then it was. The kids would say, it was my fault for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Go back to where you came from. You don't belong here. And, you know, and then the children were experiencing that after 9/11, the same thing. And I said, we can't tolerate that kind of rhetoric, that negative rhetoric. We all belong here. Americans are a land of immigrants. We all have something to contribute. And that's why it's important to know each other's cultures and our histories and our struggles so that we can work together at these times when it's necessary. Also, I remember you asked about the ACLU. So back in 1942, there weren't the organizations around to help Japanese Americans. The Quakers were peaceful. Actually, the executive director of the Northern California affiliate, Mr. Bessick, who came to visit my father to ask if he would if he could take my father's case all the way to the Supreme Court if need be. Even National ACLU at that time was friends with Roosevelt. And so they threatened Mr. Bessick with ouster from the Northern California affiliate if he helped to, help my father's case. And then later on helped with, along with others too, like the renunciators and the resistors and all those to get back their citizenships. That's what it took. So now, of course the ACLU has been good about trying to help everyone, right? But also not just them. That's what I'm saying is we have the organizations now that when you were young and my father was young that weren't there. And that's the positive of it is to support them and whether it's time or money or whatever, and to know what the issues are. And the other thing I want to say is, I know many of you here are educated and you probably voted, but I'm not sure what happened to the rest of the country. Because I'm hearing that a lot of people didn't vote. The younger generation, I mean, there aren't that many Gen Z and millennials here, but they're the ones that a lot of them didn't vote. And it's about voting in this country is our privilege, our right. I travel around the world, and there's so many different countries that can't vote. And our vote is our voice and our power. And we use it, we just like throw it away, like it's insignificant. And that's why I'm working in civics and in education to have young people know that if they want to make a difference, if they don't want to have to go under any kind of suppression and have all these kind of indignities against them, that they need to be part of this change. Don't complain, and not do anything. If you want to make change, then you have to be part of that change. And we all have that ability, and to share that with your neighbors when they start complaining. Oh, this guy, he's in D.C. Well, and what are you doing about it? What are you doing to help to make that difference and working together and knowing those issues so that we're not in this same place again? We keep repeating this history. That's why, and history is now. History is not the past. History is now. And that's why it's important to know our history and to recognize these kinds of struggles, because long after we're all gone, the next generations are going to, if we don't make that kind of change, they're going to have to go through the same thing.
Jana, can I make a comment?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so, no, it's all right. I just wanted to go back to the solidarity issue. So there's two things I'd like to say about that. If you want solidarity, you really have to go out of your community and get to know other communities. I mean, that's pretty basic. But the other part is you need to also learn your own history as much as you possibly can. So, for example, a lot of people know Japantown is about Japanese Americans, Japanese food. But this place right here was also the site of a Chinatown and a Filipino community. And this was during a time when World War II was happening. It overlaps with that too. And yet these communities were segregated here, and they had to learn to get along. So understanding that there's already built-in different communities having to work together and be together is an important part of our history is to be aware of. So the other thing I'd like to say is that for me as a Japanese American, when I was learning about US history, one of the things that had the biggest impact on me is learning the history of African Americans in this country. And I'd really encourage people to understand that, how many, decades upon decades of struggling for really basic human rights, and even beyond that, real basic civil liberties and their civil liberties being recognized, and how some people in that community always had to have, as they say, their eyes on the prize, and they had to look way forward, and they'd have to figure out how they're going to get there. And they had a lot of conflicts internally. But you can bet that one of the things they did is they also went out there and worked with other groups. And so I am really want to emphasize this. If you want solidarity, you really have to go out there and work with these communities and get to know them. One last thing I wanted to add to this, I didn't get to talk about it, is that when I was right out of college coming here, one of the groups that I worked with was called Rasa C. I don't think it exists anymore, but this was back in the 80s, and it was trying to defend what they call undocumented immigrants from Mexico, or migrants from Mexico. And so we worked with that group together, some of the Japanese Americans, Asian Americans from the community, and we learned about what their history was. We learned about what these undocumented faced. And when we learned about this, one thing happened in San Jose during this time, before the redress victory, was the Border Patrol came to pay a visit in San Jose, which is weird because there's no border here. But what they did is they would circle around elementary schools, right about either when kids were being dropped off or when they're picked up. And they did that because whenever they saw a Latino, Mexican, American-looking person, adult, they would just grab them and stick them in one of their wagons and take them away, leaving the kids in the school. So you understand the terror this created. So because some of us knew what that meant, and because we had known some of the Chicano Mexican Americans, then we helped make an issue out of that. We went to talk to people in the media, you should be covering this. And then the other thing that happened, because some of these people in Rasa C had heard about the redress struggle, and they had heard about what happened to Japanese Americans, they also told that to people. You're doing exactly what you did to Japanese Americans. And at this time, there was enough information so that had some meaning to people in the media. You can't just go pick us up. In fact, they were just picking up anybody randomly, and they picked up somebody who was a citizen. And this person, you can't do that to me. So it caused all of this turmoil, and eventually the Border Patrol left. So we didn't resolve that problem, but this is how, by learning about this community, and then by actually supporting them, but it's a process like that.
I want to, since we just have a little less than 10 minutes left, I know sometimes, the struggle for civil rights, the struggle for, that fight for justice, sometimes it can feel lonely, it can feel discouraging, it can feel difficult. And, we all are also balancing other things in life. And so I want to close just briefly to ask each of our panelists, what is the hope? What is it that is keeping you going in your desire to keep this fight going? Or maybe we shouldn't even say fight, just keep this mission that you have set yourself on. Why don't we start down at Musa and let Karen have the last word on that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'd like to start by saying everything I heard today is something that I think I'll carry with me when I leave today. The words, the stories, very inspiring, very empowering. I'm just sitting here very emotional, just thinking about everything that's been said today. But sometimes I like to say this thing, the actions that each and every one of us take, it's like a domino effect. One person does something good, that cascades to the next, and then to the next, and then to the next. It can be very simple acts of kindness, like smiling at someone, asking how their day is going, to bigger things like advocating for key critical political issues, civil rights issues. But I really believe that domino effect is how we make the world better, because all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to sit aside and do nothing. And our actions, however insignificant they may seem, the small good things that we do in our life, the smiles that we show people, the kindnesses that we do people, whether that's buying a household person a meal, opening the door for somebody. I really believe these small things are indicative of our character and our principles. And these are the things that empower us to advocate for our fellow humans in a greater capacity as well. Sounds like kind of like a cliche, but I really, really think that on that macro level and micro level, the small things we do, the small kind things we do, really reverberate through our lives and through everyone else's lives, all the people we care about, the communities that we take part in. So just remember, nothing that you do is in vain, nothing that you do is insignificant. When you go out today, think of all the acts of kindness that are shown towards you or that you show towards others, and that is a domino effect that will create that cascade of change.
When I think of hope and where I find hope, and I see this question get asked quite often in different panels, and that I think the common answer that I oftentimes, at least once hear, is that the younger generation gives me hope. Like seeing them mobilize, whether it's climate action, whether it's racial justice, and I agree, that gives me hope too. But at the same time, for me, what gives me hope is actually the connection that I have with my the older community members as well. And hearing and sharing the stories that I hear from them and their experiences. I remember right after hearing about the election results, going to the first time I ever went to the San Jose DK Resistors meeting, and being in a space where there were so many people of different age groups there, and reassuring us that, don't worry, we've been here and we know what to do. There is a path forward. Don't be devastated. And being in that sort of space where there's multiple generations, but also not just the young and the new, but also the older generation, I think that's what really gives me hope. And I know that in my mind, hope is not a passive thing. It's active. It's about taking action. It's about speaking up. It's about building connections and being intentional to try to reach out to each other. So that's what gives me hope.
This is hard for me to say, but what I've been thinking a lot about that keeps me going is some of you who know me know that one of my brothers passed away very recently. And I'm going through a process of thinking about him. He was a musician, composer, quite well known, and he made a lot of contributions through his work as an artist. So there's one part of remembering what he did. Now, the other part, though, I'm not a musician or an artist, and I cannot explain in great detail the contribution he made to his music other than I just liked it. But what he did for me, in a very quiet way, and I'm thinking about it now, is how he really showed his support for me growing up. He's my older brother. And that kind of support is something that I see being really important. And I won't be able to do that as long as I'm alive to other people. That same kind of support that he showed for me in his own way. And I also want to help people remember other people. In this case, my own brother, trying to remember him. But not just as a passive way. I wanted to be famous or something like that. But what do they stand for? And therefore, what is my obligation to carry that on? So the kind of work my brother did, even though I'm not a musician or an artist, he helped create opportunities for other people who wanted to do this work. And that was one of the things he was so proud of, working with younger people, younger musicians. So I feel it's my obligation in his remembrance to do the same thing, since he taught me that. So that keeps me going. That may not sound exactly like a super happy and hopeful thing, but that's what keeps me going as long as I'm going to be alive and do that.
For me today is a very special day because I have my family here, my son and his wife and my 3 grandchildren. And I also have my old friend from Pasadena, someone with whom I went to junior high school, and I have a new friend too, who's Chinese American. And there was a time in my life when my father told me, you can only go out with Japanese people. But now everything is so different, and I like that. We're so inclusive now. And so today is a special day for me. And also, my dear friend, Ella is here, and I met her in the last 15 years because our husbands are both hard of hearing. And so Alice and I talked. But it's so wonderful to be here with old friends and new friends. And so I think that gives me a lot of hope for the future.
Actually, all of you being here does give me hope. It's like, I wonder how many people are going to show up, is it still important? I mean, the diversity is really incredible. And then just going over to the museum and meeting people that I've never met before. A lot of the people that were there also have come from Japan. They're Japanese nationals that don't know much about the Japanese American incarceration. That's something that we're, the Korematsu Institute is working more to make that kind of change for our own community, but communities across this country, and to find that intersectionality of working with African American organizations. We talked about the HR 40, but even here in California, actually was one of my father's legal team members, Rabbit-Tomita, who's been on this commission to come up with the report about reparations for African Americans in California. But I still feel like this is something that we need to still pursue, right? And it's because the one thing that I have seen over the years, that I've been involved in all this, is the intergenerational trauma. Not just only for Japanese Americans, but for all ethnicities. Even Caucasians in this country, that feel like sometimes they are targeted, or they're misunderstood, or they're alone. And so it's about recognizing all of us, and we all have something to contribute. We all do. I mean, we're all very special in that way to share ourselves. I mean, we're humans, for goodness sakes. We're not robots yet. AI is coming, but it's still like no one wants to clone me. What do you mean? But this is part of sharing about each other and trying to make that difference. So and also I remember when you were talking about hope, is that it wasn't until my father's case was reopened in 82 when Peter Ivers and Yoshiko, we met her, and that he had never given up for almost 40 years. So my father, for almost 40 years, never gave up hope that someday he would be able to reopen a Supreme Court case. He just didn't know how to do that. It's like even members of church that are attorneys, it's not like you go up to somebody and say, by the way, I have this famous Supreme Court case. Do you want to try to reopen it? I mean, it doesn't work that way. And it took the Freedom of Information Act as well. So those types of things, the positive parts that we're able to achieve in this country, are the ones that do make a difference. And so what I would say to you is to remember that Fred Korematsu is one man who made a difference in the face of adversity, and so can you.
I'm sure that beautifully encapsulates the final question that we had, which is what is a 30-second elevator speech to explain the meaning, relevance, and importance of Fred Korematsu Day. And I think you just summed that up. That Fred Korematsu, did something, and what can you do? And that is something which, as we conclude the program now, I just want to say that it's been such a joy to be a part of this.
There have been so many wonderful discussions about the history, but also how it touches each of our panelists personally. I hope it's giving you some moments to reflect on how it touches each of you personally, and that each of you can be a multiplier effect as you leave today to have those conversations with people within your family, your neighbors, people who are your coworkers, people who are fellow students, or people that you see in the community. What Musa was saying about little acts of kindness and how much that can change. Because I do feel, and this is especially for me as a journalist, that at the same time that sometimes we tend to take individual people and raise them up to the point of being kind of symbols and icons, that can sometimes have its place. But I think fundamentally what I always try to do is come back to the idea that they are a person, whether they are Martin Luther King Jr., Korematsu, President of the United States. These are people that we're talking with. These are people that we're dealing with. And that the more that you develop that kind of trust and across different generations, across different communities, then that opens the door to understanding and to perhaps collaboration, to dialogue. And just remembering that we're all people and that who knows when, maybe tomorrow, we might be faced with a decision that will kind of test us to decide who are we, who are we? And that constant reinventing and question of what does it mean in this country to be American? Who are we as Americans? And I think that is something which, for the Korematsu Day, I think it's very powerful, that it takes us out of the daily grind of things and has us sit for a couple hours together and think about that. And I think that is something that is worthy to do. Big round of applause, please. Thank you all for sharing your stories and your time. And please, as we mentioned, the Japanese is open. We would like to have Mr. Konda come up again with a few closing remarks. And thank you again for letting me be part of this day.
Thank you so much. Well, I have two quick announcements. One is on January 30th from 11:45 a.m. to 1:30 p.m., Santa Clara University's Office for Multicultural Learning is sponsoring Korematsu Day of Civil Wrongs and Rights at the California Mission Room in Desmond Center. The film of Civil Wrongs and Rights is a short documentary film about Fred Korematsu's fight for justice. It will be shown following a panel discussion. If you are interested, at the Yale table there's a little QR code on there that you can register. Next thing is each year the Emcee Outreach Committee sponsors the Day of Remembrance program that's been mentioned before. There are flyers about the program in the back there. We encourage you to attend. It's going to be on Sunday, February 16th from 5:30 to 7:30 at the San Jose Buddhist Church Festival, which is at 632 North 5th Street, just down the road here. The theme of the OR program this year is Women Activists Leading Change. Please try to attend. Now, Tom mentioned the Rapid Response Network as a concrete way to fight against mass deportations. At the San Jose EK Resistors table, there's information on the Rapid Response Network, and we encourage you to get involved and engage. Also, at the Asian All Alliance table, you'll see these, what we call red cards. They're not for target. These are cards or tools that can be used by anybody who may have been stopped by immigration. So if either you or you know somebody who might benefit from these cards, please pick one up there. Again, I'd like to thank Jana Katsuyama for hosting today. She's done a great program. Thank you so much. And finally, we welcome Jana Katsuyama, who's the Executive Director of the Japanese American Museum San Jose. She has a few closing remarks.
Thank you so much, and again, thank you so much to our moderator and to our amazing speakers. I don't know about all of you, but that whole time I had that tight feeling in my chest where it's like emotionally thinking, am I going to cry in front of everybody right here? Or will I save it for the car? But it was very impactful and moving, so thank you all so much for sharing your stories.
Also, again, my name is Vanessa Takayama, the Executive Director of the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, and we are so honored to be a co-host of this event and to continue doing this year after year. It truly is an honor. And I wanted to welcome and invite and encourage you all to come to the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, which we know as JAMS, which is right across the street. Free entrance and admission for anyone who attends this event today, because we are launching our first bilingual exhibit called Letters from the Camps, which uplifts the voices, the actual voices, of people of the Ono family who were incarcerated at Tule Lake and at Topaz. And through their letters, they give a window into what life was like. Their own history and story told in their voices and their own words, which is so important. As a historic, cultural, and arts institution, we really feel the weight of our work right now and understand the importance of our role in making sure that our community is able to tell our own story and our own history in our own voice. So I hope that you'll take advantage of that today. We are staying open late for you guys. Late for us is 5 p.m. So I hope you take advantage of that today. And I also wanted to take a moment to thank the Wesley Methodist United Church, one of our community partners and neighbors who always so generously extends their spaces to everyone in the community to host these events. And so thank you so much to Wesley United Methodist Church. And again, I also wanted to give a shout out to another one of our community partners, the EGB Foundation, who will be hosting their Films of Remembrance event again, something that I always look forward to, a full day of films, and they bring it to us right here in San Jose, Japantown. So February 23rd is the San Jose festival date. It'll be right over at the San Jose Buddhist Church Betsuin Annex. And I hope you can make it. There's more information over there in the back. Also at the JAMS table and at JAMS. So I hope to see you there. Remember, open late, 5 o'clock. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.